Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Thank you for joining me. I've got a really interesting episode for you today, I think. I call this one Peter and the UFOs. This is a little bit different from a lot of episodes I've presented here. This one is all about one person's experiences. It's one case, but it's really quite extensive. It involves a gentleman I call Carter Wells. That's not his real name. He insisted upon being anonymous, and in fact, he had no intention of sharing his story whatsoever. It was actually his son who contacted me and asked if I could interview his father. His father did not want to talk to me at first. It took some convincing. As long as he remains anonymous and gets no attention, he decided it was okay to share his story. And yeah, it's different from most. It does involve humanoids and high strangeness, certainly, but it's got a lot to it. Missing time, onboard experiences, implants, I mean the whole deal. But a lot of real high strangeness and paranormal stuff that goes beyond a lot of what other cases I've investigated have. So I think you'll find it quite interesting because it is very unusual. Again, this case is taken from my book, Humanoids in High Strangeness, and it's probably one of my favorite chapters in the book. So I'm super excited to share it with you today, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. I certainly hope so. It was 1968, and 13-year-old Carter Wells was walking to school with his best friend Jackson Groves. Again, pseudonyms. Jackson lived just down the street from Carter, and because they both went to the same school, they had to walk the same route every day. They had plenty of time to get to know each other, and they became friends, and they soon enjoyed long, deep conversations with each other, talking about anything and everything they could imagine. And they were both really good students. They liked learning and exploring strange new things. So one day, as they were walking to school, Jackson became unusually pensive and silent, and Carter could clearly see that something was bothering him. So he asked him, "What's going on? Why are you so quiet? What happened?" And Jackson said, "Well, I don't want to tell you because I think you might think I'm crazy." But Carter assured him he wouldn't and said, "Just tell me what happened." Jackson turned to him and said that the last night he woke up in the middle of the night, standing in the center of his room, and looking at his bed, he saw that his body was actually still in bed. It was confusing because he knew he was totally awake. Everything around him looked real. He knew it wasn't a dream. And that's when he realized he was having an out-of-body experience. And as soon as he realized that, in the blink of an eye, he was back in his body and he woke up. So Carter was amazed by this and he told him, "Man, you're not crazy. That sounds really interesting to me." So Carter himself had always had very vivid, lucid-like dreams, and hearing about his friend's astral projection experience got him very excited. So they spent the rest of the walk going to school talking about Jackson's out-of-body experience. They had heard of astral projection, but only a little bit. They knew almost nothing about it. But they both were convinced that Jackson had had a genuine out-of-body experience. And the more they talked about it, the more interested they became in the subject and vowed to learn how to do it. As Carter says, "I just thought it was one of the coolest ways to find stuff out. You could just go anywhere. To be honest, I thought it would be fun to go into the girls' dressing room and spy on naked babes. I wanted to go check out planets and go into the earth. I just thought, man, this is like being a genie. You could go anywhere. You can fly. The walls can't stop you." My friend Jackson and I, we were so into it. We were like Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn astral buddies. We thought we'd go out and gallivant and have a blast. So at this time they were living in Toronto in Ontario, Canada, and they went directly to the library to find some books on this. Could not find one single book. But Jackson had an idea. He had done a paper route since he was a little kid, and he had gotten to know the local neighborhood pretty good. And he knew about a place called the Rosicrucian Center. This was located near the intersection of Danforth and Broadview. And you can see it here. This is the Rosicrucian Center where they went to visit, because Jackson knew that they had a library of esoteric books. And he thought, well, maybe they have something on the subject. So as Carter says, we just boldly went knocking on their door one day. This old lady met us at the door, and we asked her if we could access their library. She kind of looked at us. She looked above us and all around us. I didn't know what she was doing. I thought she was crazy. She was kind of goofy, and I was getting ready to leave, but then she gave us the go-ahead. So they both went into the library, searched the shelves for any kind of book on astral projection, and there wasn't a single one. But Carter did find an interesting book called Cosmic Consciousness. This is written by Richard Maurice Buck. It's a very well-known book. While it doesn't provide instructions on astral travel or even really talk about it at all, it was all about raising one's consciousness, and this really captured Carter's attention. And it soon became his favorite book. I mean, he was reading it in school other than his school textbooks. So one way or another, both were very much committed to trying to achieve astral projection. As Carter says, I just immersed myself in this stuff. Every day after school, we'd go home, go to my room, and we'd try to leave our bodies until dinner time. So what happened was, we kind of activated something in ourselves by practicing this all the time. So this went on for a couple of years. Both boys read anything they could find about esoteric subjects and spirituality. Both became huge fans of science fiction. They continued to meditate and try to astral project, but unfortunately they never did succeed. But then something very strange and synchronistic happened. It was one evening as Jackson was walking home from his girlfriend's house. This is when he lived in the small town of Newmarket, she did. So it was a pretty long distance to Jackson's home, and he had to hitchhike, and often would. So he was walking along an isolated section of highway surrounded only by fields when a truck suddenly pulled over next to him. Two men exited the truck and kind of whispered to him, "Be careful, the guy that's driving is really weird." And the two men walked off into the fields. And this was weird because there was nothing out there. And Jackson's like, well, where the heck are they going? Again, back in those days, hitchhiking was much more popular and wasn't really considered dangerous. At any rate, when the truck door remained open, Jackson climbed up into the front passenger seat and looked at the driver. And he was amazed to see this enormously obese man, humongous. He was Caucasian, appeared to be in his mid-30s, had sandy brown hair, was slightly balding. But it was what this man said next that left Jackson absolutely amazed, because the man knew his name. And he said, "Well, Jackson," he was smiling, "how's it going with the astral traveling?" So Jackson, needless to say, was absolutely amazed. He had never seen this man before. This man did not know him. And he had not talked really about his efforts to learn astral projection with anything but Carter. So there was no way this man could know this. So Jackson asked him, "How do you know my name? And how do you know about what I'm trying to do?" And the man threw his head back and laughed loudly, and he said, "Oh, you know, we've been sort of keeping our eyes on you guys for a while." So this really stunned him to the degree that he didn't know how to react, and instead they began to talk. And this is when the man introduced himself as Peter and said that he worked as a truck driver delivering produce to various towns outside of Toronto, and that he was very encouraged to learn that Jackson and his friend Carter were interested in these deep spiritual subjects. Jackson says he felt immediately at ease with this man, felt like he was an old friend. Peter seemed to exude confidence and wisdom and kindness like nobody else he had ever met. So before he knew it, they had arrived at Jackson's home. Jackson asked if he could meet Peter again. They agreed. They exchanged phone numbers. And it was a week or two later that Peter agreed to meet Jackson. and showed up at his house in a small car. They drove off together to a small basement apartment on the outskirts of Toronto. Now, Peter didn't talk much about himself, but did say that he grew up in the suburbs of Cabbagetown. This was not a good neighborhood. But they talked into the night about all kinds of deep subjects, mostly spiritual and philosophical. And Peter explained to Jackson that all humans have psychic abilities that they have only begun to understand. And at one point he set an ashtray in front of Jackson and said, "Okay, learn about the universe. Make it disappear." So very much intrigued, Jackson focused on the ashtray and concentrated on making it disappear. Obviously it did not work, but Peter explained that humans do have all kinds of psychic abilities, that they can call forth the wind, and he actually demonstrated this for Jackson. And Jackson said that he seemed to be able to read his mind because he would answer Jackson's questions as he formulated them. So this went on throughout the night, and it was all about trying to help Jackson learn to grow and develop his psychic abilities. At one point, Peter did bring up the subject of UFOs and said that he actually worked with the ETs and flew their craft, transporting various freights around. But Jackson was mostly struck by Peter's incredible kindness and wisdom. He said the man had a presence about him that made him seem totally trustworthy and very spiritually advanced. So they talked about all kinds of subjects. He said Peter was incredibly funny as well and would just say things that would leave Jackson in spasms of laughter. The evening finally ended, and Peter drove Jackson home, promising to meet him again. So the third meeting came a short time later. Peter showed up at Jackson's house, again driving a different car, a fancy convertible. And they took a drive out into the country, and Jackson found himself sharing all about his interests of going into space, learning how to do out-of-body travel, science fiction. He said there was something about this guy that made it easy to talk to him about anything. And at one point, while they were returning home back to Toronto, Peter suddenly pulled the car over on a remote section of highway, and normally very smiling and jovial, he became suddenly stern and made an announcement that really caught Jackson off guard. Peter said, "If I called down a spaceship right now, would you be willing to go for a ride?" And Jackson felt this wave of fear when he realized Peter was being entirely serious. And he had no doubt Peter could actually do this. And he was afraid if he said yes, a UFO would show up. And things suddenly became far too real. It was too much. And Jackson said, "No, thanks." And hearing this, Peter threw back his head and just laughed and laughed. And it was at that moment this really powerful wind swept down and swirled all around them. It was so strong, he said, it practically lifted him out of the car. So there was this weird calling of the wind again, which is something that would happen over and over again. So finally, Jackson shared all this with Carter. And Carter was astonished because Peter sounded absolutely incredible. And Carter said, "I really want to meet him." And Jackson said, "Okay." So Carter was super excited. This would be the first time he could find anybody that had any interest besides Jackson in astral projection and all these esoteric subjects. By now it's the summer of 1970, and it turns out that Carter's parents owned a small cottage about 15 miles north of Toronto, outside of Toronto, in the small country town of Rosedale. This is just a little town. And in fact, Carter and Jackson and their friends would often hitchhike up there to get away from the city and listen to Moody Blues and hike in the surrounding woods, rest along the shore of Balsam Lake, which is this really beautiful area. Usually there was 4 of them: Jackson, Carter, Carter's cousin Dan, and their friend Sammy. Again, those are pseudonyms. But all 4 of these young men who were very interested in OBEs, life after death, UFOs, consciousness, astronomy, spirituality, and all these kinds of things. And Carter and Jackson decided that this would be the ideal place to meet with Peter. So Jackson called Peter up, and Peter agreed. So on that one morning, they all gathered at Dan's house waiting for Peter to arrive. And everyone's asking, well, what are we looking for? What does he look like? What kind of car does he drive? And Jackson explained, well, he's really fat. He has short hair. He's kind of bald on top. But I can't tell you what he's going to drive because it's always a different car. And sure enough, this car pulls up. It's a Volkswagen Beetle. And they're sure it's him. They all go running out to meet him. And there is a big guy in there, but he's got this massive head of hair. And so as they approached him, the boys were like, oh, shoot, sorry. We thought you were someone else. And turns out it was him. He comes out of the car and he's laughing and laughing, and he reaches up and pulls off his wig. And it's him. It's Peter, this enormously obese man. So this was another weird thing that happened. They all get in the car, and since Carter knows the way there, he sits in the front seat, and the other three boys squeeze into the back. And as they're driving along, Carter says, and I'll just quote Carter directly, we're driving along, and there were these amazing biblical clouds, gorgeous and puffy. And there's one cloud that had a perfectly square rectangular hole in it with blue sky behind. And I was like, wow, holy crap, look at that. Can you guys see this? And at this point, Peter says something very strange. He turns to Carter and says, yeah, there's a door up there. Why don't you go through it? And Carter looked at him in confusion, like, what? Peter just laughed. He would often laugh like this, as Carter says. So Peter didn't know quite what he meant, but he tried to imagine himself going through the door. Nothing happened. But there was this weird sensation because, as Peter says, or rather as Carter says in his own words, he's there driving, and it felt like he was turned and staring at me with his full attention. It was so intense that I would kind of glance over at him, and he would just be looking ahead driving. The sense of presence that he could operate no matter what his body was doing was new to me. I'd never experienced anybody like that before. So at some point during the drive to the cabin, the boys said that they needed to stop and pee. They pulled over on the highway near this beautiful wooded area where there was this huge grove of trees. This is later going to be important. And all four boys ran off into the woods, relieved themselves, piled back into the car, and continued on their way. They drove up to the cottage, and the plan was for Peter to stay there with them. And he did. He stayed for the day, and they got to know Peter. Peter explained that, again, he worked as a truck driver, but that he was really on Earth as a guide. And the boys asked him all kinds of questions. Carter, of course, asked him about UFOs, and Peter said that, yeah, he worked with the ETs. As Carter says, he made references to actually working on UFOs, almost like they were freighters, and he was hired on to transport stuff, which I thought was interesting. I never really thought of them like that, but he implied that he could contact them. Of course, Peter also talked about calling the wind. He took them outside and demonstrated it. As Carter says, he had some kind of connection with the wind. He could just conjure up the wind. It was the most amazing thing. So Peter also noticed that Carter had this tendency to answer their questions before they could actually ask them. And instead of being freaked out by this, Carter found it to be actually comfortable and natural. And they talked about all kinds of subjects. And at one point, Peter said something very strange. He said that he no longer ate food, that he had long ago given up eating food. And this was really confusing to the boys. And Peter just said, basically, well, what do you guys think food is? And the boys had no answer for this. And Peter said, well, it's sunlight. It's just transformed sunlight. And there are ways you can extract energy directly from the sun. And that's what I do. It just works for me. It's an easier way for me to exist. So Carter couldn't believe this, and he's looking at Peter's enormous overhanging belly. I mean, the guy was obese. And Carter nearly burst out laughing. And finally he just said, then why are you so fat? Peter thought this was the funniest thing. All four of the boys started howling with laughter. And Peter laughed with them, but then suddenly became sober and serious and said, well, I do this because I'm a walking billboard. When I walk down Yonge Street in Toronto, people can't help but notice me. In a split second of eye contact, I can tell if they're ready for guidance. So, yeah, he's apparently some sort of spirit guide. And he told Peter told Carter and the other kids, I am quite excited to meet you four kids. You guys are just amazing. You're only 15, and you've been into this stuff for a couple of years already. I'm really impressed. It's really refreshing to meet young people who are just so open to this stuff. So this was a transformational evening for Carter. At one point, he decided to just go outside and lay in the grass and meditate. And he says he was just lying there thinking of a question and thought in his mind, Peter, I have a question for you. Well, apparently at that moment, Peter was inside with the guys. He stopped what he was doing and said, hang on a second. Carter wants to ask me something. And next thing you know, he squatted down beside Carter and says, okay, what's up? And Carter again said that felt completely normal, that this man could read his mind. Finally, Carter did ask Peter about how to go out of body, how to astral project. Peter just kind of laughed and rolled his eyes as if learning how to do astral projection was a lower spiritual practice to the other things he was trying to teach them, but said, okay, I'll show you what I can. They went outside and laid down in the grass. Peter told him to pick a star and just focus on it. And Carter walked about 30 feet away, lay down, and picked a star and looked at it. And the next thing he knows, he's waking up. He had fallen asleep, apparently. And he jumped up and had this incredible sense of love and gratitude and just felt this incredible affection for Peter, like he's some sort of spiritual master of some kind. They went back inside, and turned out 15 minutes had gone by, and Carter does not remember that. As Carter says, honestly, my experience was, we went out, I lay down, I looked at the stars, I blinked, we got up, and I came in. That's what I experienced in terms of the time. So I had missing time here. I don't know what happened, but something big, something just completely knocked me out. So at that point, they all went to bed. Peter left the next morning, and he promised to pick them up and drive them back to Toronto at the end of the week. And this is when some really interesting things began to happen. As Carter says, it was during that week when all the UFO stuff started showing up. Now, it was a day or two after Peter left. Carter was in the cottage alone. It was nighttime when Jackson and their friend Sammy came running into the cottage with an incredible story. They announced to Carter, we just saw a Martian. And they explained that they were on the docks by the Highway 35 bridge, which spanned the Rosedale River, leading to Balsam Lake. You can see it here. And as Carter says, they described it. And it was exactly like what we think of today as a gray. A little guy with a big head, big eyes, a skinny little body. And they saw it. They saw this thing. And we have never experienced anything like that before, so we were very excited. We all ran out to go see it, and there was nothing there. Of course, at that time, there weren't really a whole lot of books on UFOs and really no descriptions of grays whatsoever. But Jackson and Sammy had gotten a good look at this figure. They could clearly see it was not human. It was not that far away. So all of them were super amazed by this strange synchronicity of talking with Peter about UFOs and aliens, to have only a few days later one of these aliens show up. But events weren't over yet. They had recently met another boy their age who also lived in Rosedale, And a day or two later, they all walked over to his house to hang out and talk about their sighting of the, quote, Martian. And evening came. It was time to return to Carter's parents' cottage, and the four of them were heading back in a group. But as they began to cross this same bridge, the Rosedale Bridge, Carter got ahead of the others. He was walking about 50 feet ahead and had almost reached the end of the bridge, and looking down over the side at the parking lot, which you can see here, he saw a short, thin, gray-skinned being. Now this parking lot was pretty well lit, and this being was standing only about 100 feet away, close enough for Carter to see him clearly, and he knew instantly it was the Martian. I mean, it looked exactly like Jackson and Sammy had described. Gray skin, a large hairless head, a skinny body, huge dark eyes. Carter said he couldn't tell if it was wearing anything, but if it was, it had to be a skin-tight suit without any markings on it. But what was most amazing to Carter was how this being reacted. And I'll just let Carter describe this because it's so interesting. As Carter says, "I saw this little being. It looked like a little gray alien. And when I first saw it, my body reacted, and I kind of jerked. And it mimicked me. And I saw what it did, and I kind of shook my head and looked at it, and it did the same thing. It was kind of playing with me. It was really playful. I had this whole little interaction with it. It was like mimicking me and bouncing around, kind of over-exaggerating my movements. It was very playful. It was just standing there in this empty parking lot. It was completely visible. It was easy to see it and all of its movements. The energy coming off this guy was so fun and playful." So Carter felt no fear. He said the little gray almost seemed elf-like, and he stared in awe and wonder and delight, actually. And he said the gray itself seemed to be equally entertained, and he watched it for about 30 seconds. And then it did something which absolutely amazed him. As Carter says, "All of a sudden, it was like something overlapped in my mind, and I couldn't see it anymore. And I just totally knew that it was still there. But it was somehow able to manipulate frequencies or my perception in some way that it could just kind of show up and disappear. But it wasn't disappearing. It wasn't gone. And all of this just happened so fast." So although Carter was sure this ET was still there, he could not see it. And it was at that exact moment, of course, that Carter's friends showed up, caught up with him. He told them what he had seen, and they said, "Well, that's exactly what we saw." And it was in the exact same place. The only difference was Jackson and Sammy had seen it from a different perspective on the docks. So they stayed for just a little while. It did not reveal itself again, the ET, so they went back to the cottage. And it wasn't until years later, when reports of grays surfaced in the popular media, that they realized their Martian was actually a gray. So finally, at the end of the week, Peter arrived to take them home, and they were all full of questions for him. They stayed up all night and asked him all about all kinds of stuff. And Carter was just so excited to have finally met someone who could talk about this stuff. They told him what happened. He just smiled and laughed and kind of looked at them, he said, with this bemused, knowing expression, but wouldn't say much about it. So that was curious. Peter, again, of course, showed up in a different car and took them home. The boys asked if they could see him again, and he agreed to meet them in a week or two. But, alas, it was not meant to be, because following this experience, Peter pretty much disappeared completely from their lives. As Carter says, he disappeared after that. He completely disappeared. And I have to say, he left such an impression on me. I was heartbroken when he disappeared. There's a lot later on that I haven't mentioned about what I experienced in this guy's presence. But in short, it was like when we'd look into his eyes, it was like looking and seeing someone that you had forgotten about. Someone so dear and precious to you. Like a great-great-great-grandfather or something. It was just like this indescribable feeling of love and connection. It's hard to describe it. Now, all four boys felt the same way, like he was a long-lost, lifelong friend, and all of them really experienced the pain of his loss and talked about him endlessly because there were so many strange things about him. They wondered if he was even human. Was he a guardian angel? Could he be an extraterrestrial? Was he an enlightened master? But he was so normal looking and he was so fat. So they did not know what to think about this guy. They did tell others about their sighting of the Martian. Most people did not believe them. Some were interested. They did find one local kid who absolutely believed him. They had become friends with him, and he said that he lived on the other side of the bridge and had a long way to walk home, and one day he was walking past a field when a little silver disc popped up out of the tall grass and shot upwards. It was completely unexpected, scared the hell out of him. It was 1 month later after Peter had gone that they were back in Rosedale. It was a bright sunny day. He had traveled by boat to Grand Island, which is located on the center of Balsam Lake, and looking northwest towards Rosedale, about 2 miles away, hovering maybe 600 feet in the sky or so, maybe 1,000 feet, was a gigantic, shiny, metallic golden disc, your classic flying saucer. As Carter says, it was this incredibly bright, shining, golden, classic UFO right over Rosedale. We're across the lake looking at this thing, this ship. It looked like this beautiful, burnished, polished gold, and it just sat there perfectly still for about 20 minutes. So people were out there water skiing and doing all kinds of stuff, but Carter spent the whole time just watching this thing. Some people would come, look at it for 5 minutes, and then weirdly lose interest. And he looked away and suddenly it was gone. He did not see it leave, so he doesn't know if it faded away or darted off. It just suddenly wasn't there. So winter arrived and they started spending much more of their time back in Toronto. And one day Carter's cousin Dan was hanging out with some friends at a little burger joint on the outskirts of Toronto. This was in February, sitting in a booth, and he saw this car pull up into the parking lot. Out stepped several tough-looking young men wearing sleeveless shirts, their hair all greased back, and then, to Dan's absolute shock, coming out of the same car was Peter. So Dan stared in absolute disbelief. He couldn't believe it. There was no mistaking it. This was Peter. He was very easy to recognize. But he couldn't believe that he was hanging out with these young thugs. It made no sense because Dan and Carter and these other guys, Sammy, were all very studious, intelligent, spiritually minded young men. But these guys, according to Dan, were borderline criminals, or so they appeared to be. And he wondered why someone like Peter, who was so incredible, would be hanging out with these delinquents. But he was. And Peter and these young guys walked in. And this is when something very strange happened, because Dan wanted to jump up and introduce himself and talk to Peter, but Peter turned and looked at him, and Dan discovered that he could not move. He was absolutely paralyzed, couldn't move, couldn't say a word. He really wanted to get up and say something, but for some reason he just couldn't. He said it was as if his entire nervous system had just shut down. And it stayed that way for the entire time Peter and these men were in there. They ordered some food, waited for it, and during this time, Peter would occasionally glance over at Dan, but after about 10 or 15 minutes, they got their food, got back into the car, and drove off. And once the car was actually out of sight, Dan could move. And, he was sitting at the table with his friends, and none of them noticed anything, which was also weird. So Dan went straight home and called Carter and Sammy and Jackson about his Peter sighting, and everyone was amazed. Peter was still around, but unfortunately, he never showed up again. However, at this point, they decided to do some investigating. Jackson had met Peter at his basement apartment on the outskirts of Toronto, so he went there, and there was no answer. So he went to the upstairs house and knocked on the door, and a little old lady answered, and Jackson said, "Excuse me, ma'am, can you tell me where the guy is who lived downstairs? And she looked at him absolutely bewildered and said, what are you talking about? Jackson said, you know, the big guy, the big, huge guy who lived down there. And the woman said there was no such man. Jackson persisted, and she became angry. She said, listen, this is my home. I would know if someone was living down there, and no one like that has ever been here. So I don't even know how you can explain that. But Jackson is absolutely sure that this is where he had met with Peter, done little psychic exercises like trying to make the ashtray disappear. So it made no sense, but again, nothing about Peter seemed to make sense. And they discovered another mystery. When Peter had first driven them to Carter's cottage in Rosedale, they had pulled off the road so the boys could relieve themselves, but now traveling the same route again, Carter could not find the location where they had stopped, by this grove of trees. And it really baffled him. As Carter says, it was literally between these two towns. It was maybe 15 miles. I could never find it, and it was weird. It became a thing. I became obsessed, like afterwards, since after this guy came and went. But it was just, it might seem like a small thing, but it was one of so many weird things about Peter that just left them all wondering who was this guy. So, Peter continued to affect them long after he had gone. What really baffled them most was Peter's ability to call the wind. It made them look at the wind in a whole new way. Because, Jackson had met Peter on 5 occasions, while Carter and the others had only met him twice. But it completely changed their lives. As Carter says, for years afterwards, I'd be sitting up at the cottage or anywhere, and I'd hear a wind blowing by, and I'd go out and feel it. We would call them Peter winds. And when I would feel it, it was like a call. It was like no matter what I was doing, I would just take off, boom, and follow my intuition. And this would lead to some really interesting synchronicities and all kinds of psychic experiences. And as Carter says, that's why I was so broken when he disappeared. But he still had a connection, Carter did, with Peter. He'd be trying to leave his body, and suddenly he could feel Peter's presence. Unfortunately, Carter never did succeed in astral projection, but he did have these interesting telepathic communications with Peter for a long time afterwards. As he says, suddenly I would connect, and he'd be there communicating to me. And one time, it was about 2 weeks after Peter left, Carter got this communication from him that he was going to die at the end of the week, that it was his time to go back to his spiritual home. And while this may sound tragic and scary, Carter was actually excited because he believed in life after death. And it left him in a bit of a quandary. He knew he was going to miss his family, but some part of him was really excited about all of this. And Friday arrived, and there was a celebration going on in downtown Toronto. And Carter says he was just overcome with this feeling of absolute oneness and love and empathy with everyone all around him. He said it was almost to the point where he was drunk, that he could barely walk. He was just completely blissed out. He said, I just felt like I was dissolving in love, this universal love. And the feeling persisted all day, and the day ended, and Carter was still alive. He was strangely, slightly disappointed, but at the same time, he knew something really profound had happened to him. As he says, I felt different, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. Later, he read about walk-ins and wondered if he had experienced some kind of soul exchange or something, like maybe part of him did die and another part came in. He doesn't know, but all he knows is, quote, it all happened in this extreme field of love. So time went on, years passed. Carter grew up, he left Toronto, traveled all over the world, and often thought about Peter. As he says, it affected me for years and years. Honestly, I was just always calling to him telepathically to come back, come back. He hitchhiked all over the world, across Europe, North Africa, always hoping to see Peter again. He never did, but he became a spiritual seeker. He came upon the works of Gurdjieff and Uspensky and just ate it up. But, there are all kinds of gurus out there in Vancouver where he lived. All these people trying to be spiritual, and as Carter says, I checked out a lot of them, and none of them held a candle to the presence of the truck driver. So, years later, Carter again decided to travel. He moved to Hawaii. He loved the weather there and the wilderness. He moved off-grid, like many contactees do. Built this little cabin with no electricity or running water, but it was really comfortable. He met a beautiful woman. They fell in love, got married, and were very happy in this tiny off-grid house. And one night, in the middle of the night, they woke up to go to the bathroom. And as they were climbing down the ladder from the loft, the whole house filled up with bright light, like floodlights blazing into the windows, which wasn't possible because this was out in the wilderness. There were no roads. And they relieved themselves and were climbing back into the house when again it blazed with brilliant light. So they knew something was happening. And he asked his wife if she had any weird dreams prior to waking up right before this happened. And she said, well, actually, yeah. I dreamt I was on a ship or something, like this strange airplane, and there was this strange little man there eating ice cream. And Carter wondered about that. But he decided to meditate and see if he could recall anything, and he did. As he says, I'll just quote him directly, this whole thing just unfolded in my head. I was like almost a specialist kind of pilot, and my consciousness, had been put into this UFO type of machine, my consciousness. And this machine was so sophisticated, it was like a living nervous system that needs a living consciousness to operate it, just like our physical body. I was test piloting some kind of new system. It was like I was immersed in it. I was inside. I was the consciousness living inside the living wiring of this thing. And it was very complex as a body. It was like that. It was all golden, like everything was made of gold filaments. Everything was golden and clean and super precise and yet living. It had a living dynamic to it. It was super responsive to your consciousness, whatever I was thinking. So Carter recalled all this, and he said it felt almost as like he was being trained how to pilot a UFO, which is certainly something I've heard many times from other contactees. And this was when their house suddenly filled up with light. And the next morning they woke up to another strange mystery. They both had this hard little bump on their arm in the same place. Carter had it on his left arm. His wife had it on her right arm. And as Carter says, I assumed it was some kind of implant. This kind of concerned him. At the time, his wife was pregnant with their first child. So he had some concerns about this. He wondered if perhaps this was missing time and onboard experience. It certainly sounds like it. He did try to cut this implant out of his arm, but he never was able to do it. At any rate, they decided that they would move back to the mainland because the house where they lived off-grid was not really well suited to raise a child, and ended up moving to the small city of Auburn, California, a tiny, quaint little town, and he continued to see UFOs. He says, and I quote, I see those quite a lot actually. I don't know what they are, but that's a pretty common thing. I've seen lots of stuff like that. Little things going on in the sky. So that is Carter's story. He's now in his late 60s. He's enjoying his retirement. He never thought he would talk about this. A couple of his friends have passed on who were there. One is still living, but he doesn't really remember a whole lot about it, other than that Peter was a real person. And when Carter started to hear Grays being portrayed as, quote, dark, evil, little bastard, he was very puzzled because that was not his experience at all. Either way, he feels certain that the UFO phenomenon and ET contact has a very strong spiritual component, and he's very optimistic about it and the state of the world. As he says in his own words, I feel hopeful. I know the world looks pretty messed up right now, but I still feel hopeful. The glimpse of beauty that I saw back then, I feel like we're getting there. I really do. I feel like one day humankind is going to find its true kindness. And that is the story of Peter and the UFOs and the experiences of Carter Wells. And as you can see, it affected him profoundly throughout his life, but especially after age 13 and meeting this gentleman, Peter. Frankly, I think Peter is probably an ET himself. I really do. An angel, perhaps, certainly an enlightened person of some kind. And such a shame that Carter never met him again, but he certainly thinks about him on a pretty much daily basis. And I think you can understand why, considering that amazing experience he had with him. I mean, wow, who was this guy? I mean, such an interesting story, all the way from the psychic aspects to Peter's claims to how he could apparently control the wind. Said he didn't need food, and yet here he is enormously obese. There's a lot of really interesting things I think we can learn from this particular UFO contact story because it is so different from others. In fact, when I was interviewing Carter, he asked me, do you want to hear the whole story, the spiritual sides, the high strangeness? And I said, absolutely yes. That's exactly why I want to talk to you, because there is a lot more to UFO contact than just being taken on board and physically examined. I think that's a total misconception. ET contact is far more profound and spiritual than just that. And I think this case really shows that in a remarkable way. And that's why I wanted to share it with you today. Again, it was taken from my book, Humanoids in High Strangeness. I left some parts out, so if you want to know the whole story, you'll have to check out the book. But it's just one of many, many really interesting cases involving humanoids and high strangeness that are in the book. But again, it's certainly one of my favorite chapters because it is so unusual. I like it because there's a lot of evidence to it as well, with multiple witnesses and physiological effects and spiritual and psychic effects and multiple UFO sightings and missing time and implants and just so much to it. So that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I truly thank you once again for watching. I really appreciate it a lot. It's because of you guys that I do this show. So thank you. And until next time, I'll just do my typical sign off. Keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. I know I am. Hope you are too. Bye for now.